It was one of those April mornings when St. Mary Mead seemed to float halfway between dream and reality. The air was perfumed with the sweetness of early cherry blossoms, and the narrow lanes were alive with the rustle of ribbons, parasols, and cheerful chatter. The Cherry Blossom Fair, an annual celebration of spring, was in full bloom upon the village green, and everyone from the vicar's wife to the postmistress had found some excuse to be there. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in a wide straw hat that threatened to take flight at the slightest gust, was overseeing the cake stall. "3d for the Victoria sponge and 2d for the seed cake," she called, waving a wooden spoon with the air of a general commanding troops. Her friend, Miss Jane Marple, stood nearby, her delicate gloved hands folded neatly over the handle of her parasol. She had declined to assist at the cake stall, claiming her eyesight was no longer what it used to be when it came to counting change. In truth, she preferred to stand a little apart, watching people as they passed, an occupation she found infinitely more enlightening than any game of whist or round of croquet. From her vantage point, she could see nearly everyone of importance in the village and several who wished to be thought so. There was young Mrs. Felicity Harrow, fluttering her lashes at Major Penrose by the Punch and Judy tent, and old Mr. Waring limping about with his walking stick, complaining that the music from the gramophone store was enough to wake the dead. Miss Marple noted the irony later. The day wore on, laughter and music spilling like sunlight through the trees. Then, quite suddenly, the harmony shattered. A shrill cry, a woman's, pierced the warm afternoon air. Heads turned, and then, like ripples in a pond, the crowd parted to reveal the source of the commotion. Behind the fortune-teller's tent, sprawled half-hidden among the fallen cherry petals, lay the body of a man. His face was ghostly pale, his collar darkened with blood. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Good heavens!" she cried. "It's Mr. Harrow, Felicity's husband." There was a collective murmur, a rising tide of disbelief and curiosity. The vicar's wife fainted gracefully into the arms of the local constable, while Miss Hartnell declared, "I always said that man would come to a bad end." Miss Marple did not speak. She merely tilted her head, her clear blue eyes resting not on the body, but on the ground nearby, where a single torn cherry blossom petal clung oddly to a polished shoe. She sighed, very softly, as though some small, sad truth had already occurred to her. "Dear me," she murmured, almost to herself. "It always begins so prettily in spring." The hush that followed was the kind that swallows conversation and breath alike. People looked at one another and then back at the fallen man, as if by sharing gazes they might lighten the weight of it. Mrs. Bantry, though pale, regained her command of herself with admirable speed. She pressed the wooden spoon into the hands of a bewildered girl guide and whispered, "Hold the fort," before bustling toward the constable. Miss Marple, moving with the quiet economy that always made her seem to arrive without having walked at all, followed at a slight remove, her eyes modestly lowered, as if the grass held more interest than tragedy. Felicity Harrow's voice preceded her slim figure, a high, strained note that seemed to cleave the afternoon. She had been coaxed away from the Punch and Judy show by a neighbor who had heard the cry. Now she stopped short, one gloved hand at her throat. Miss Marple saw shock travel across the young woman's face in little waves, like wind over a pond. Disbelief, then dread, and finally something tightly shuttered that could have been grief or its rehearsal. Major Penrose, 2 steps behind, paused in the lee of the tent, his jaw set, his military moustache stiff with purpose, as though the mere arrangement of his features might impose order. "Stand back now," Constable Hargreaves said, finding a voice both practical and respectful. "Stand back, if you please." He was a capable man with a kind face, and today he had the look of someone who had been handed a task too large for his hands, but was determined to keep it from falling. Miss Marple noticed, without seeming to look, that Felicity did not step closer. She stopped a few yards off and kept her distance precisely, as though the space had been measured beforehand. Her hand fell from her throat and settled at her waist, fingers kneading the satin belt of her dress. A woman unequipped with the habit of self-command would have cried and flung herself forward. Felicity had the air of someone who had rehearsed decorum and was faithful to it. "It might be best," Miss Marple said softly to Dolly Bantry, "if someone thought to fetch the vicar when he is revived, and perhaps tea for Mrs. Prothero. Fainting is, in my experience, terribly fatiguing. Tea, yes. Good heavens, yes." Dolly spun, rallied a small committee with a look, and within moments the practical machinery of St. Mary Mead began to hum. As ever, the village met calamity with the same tools used for fêtes and harvest suppers: kettles, blankets, and gossip. Gossip, in fact, arrived faster than tea. By the time the vicar's wife was settled on a wooden chair and a shawl found for her shoulders, there were already explanations sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Old Mr. Waring, cane planted like a flag, muttered about the foreign ways of the fortune-teller. Mrs. Price Ridley recalled that she had once seen Mr. Harrow arguing with a tradesman at the station about a parcel that had gone missing, and considered the matter plainly connected. Miss Hartnell, whose opinions were a type of currency in the village, declared that men did not come to blood without women being at the root of it, and her glance slid meaningfully to Felicity, who had not noticed, or pretended not to notice, riding a rigid composure like a cyclist balancing down a narrow lane. Major Penrose drew Hargreaves aside. They spoke briefly, the Major pointing with a discreet hand at the trampled grass near the tent flap and the scattered petals that made a pale confetti across the earth. Hargreaves nodded, terribly grateful for the Major's air of knowing, and then crouched beside the body with a caution that suggested memory of sensible instructions. The collar was indeed dark with blood. The wound, when uncovered, showed itself to be neat and decisive, the work of a blade rather than a clumsy instrument. A gentleman's knife, perhaps. Or a lady's? Miss Marple did not look directly at the wound. Her gaze was occupied with the polished shoe upon which a single torn petal clung at a peculiar angle, and then with the edge of the fortune-teller's awning, where a faint smear, grease paint, darkened the canvas. She allowed her eyes to travel to the ground. The grass leaned in one direction near the back of the tent, as if a weight had pressed it, and then resumed its upright posture a yard away, a little crease in green. "Mrs. Harrow," Hargreaves said, rising carefully, "I am very sorry. I shall need to ask you a few questions if you feel equal to it." Felicity's lips trembled obediently. "Of course," she said, and took a tiny, measured step toward her husband. "Of course, Constable, only, must he stay like that? It seems ungentle." "We'll see him properly attended," Hargreaves replied, and flushed, because gentleness to the dead had not been first in his mind. A little circle formed at once, as circles will, with those who fancied themselves necessary, crowded just on the far side of propriety. Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple stood slightly behind, and yet nothing passed beyond Miss Marple's notice. She listened as Hargreaves asked the usual questions and heard the answers offered in the careful cadence of someone aware of how every word will sound when repeated at supper. "I'd been at the Punch and Judy," Felicity said. "Major Penrose persuaded me to leave the crowd, so stuffy, and walk toward the green, where there was a breeze. I left my husband by the gramophone, speaking to Mr. Larch, the brewer. They were discussing some arrangement, I think for a barrel for the village hall. I don't know why he would come back here." Her eyes flicked toward the fortune-teller's tent and away again, a swallow of distaste barely registering in her throat. "Did your husband have any enemies, ma'am?" Hargreaves asked, in a voice that tried to hide its own curiosity amongst the politeness. "Enemies?" Felicity repeated. She considered. "My husband was a practical man. Practical men collect annoyances the way a black coat collects lint, but enemies." She shook her head, and the hat's cherry ribbon shivered. "No one who would. This." Major Penrose cleared his throat. "Hargreaves, if I might. There was a scuffle by the tent earlier. The fortune-teller had words with a young man, Stanley Briggs, if I've his name, over the price of a reading. Briggs is hot-headed. The lady was provocative." He coloured. "One ought not to encourage such entertainments." "There we are," Miss Hartnell announced, to no one in particular, and to everyone. "It will be that woman. Cards and scarves and wicked eyes." "You could see it?" Miss Marple smiled, a gentle thing that could have been agreement or merely good manners. In her experience, wickedness seldom dressed itself so plainly. "Stanley Briggs," she ventured, as if the name were an old acquaintance she had difficulty recalling. "The bicycle boy from the post office? Such a nice sister he has, a very steady girl. People can be so much steadier for having someone steady at home, I always think." "She's not at home today," Dolly murmured. "I saw her helping the Women's Institute with the scones. He would have been at a loose end." "Loose ends," Miss Marple said mildly, "do love to knot themselves, given the least encouragement." Hargreaves, encouraged by the Major's clue, dispatched young Tom Burrows to fetch Stanley Briggs and another boy to inquire after the fortune-teller, who had retreated into her tent and tied the flap with a decisiveness that spoke of either fear or calculation. The grammar school children, wide-eyed, performed their errands with a speed that was half zeal and half the delicious terror of being involved. "Mr. Larch," Dolly said suddenly, turning to Miss Marple. "Where is he? If Mr. Harrow spoke to him last—" "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "How sensible." She turned her head with the absent air of someone admiring a blossom and, quite incidentally, found Mr. Larch at the edge of the green, pretending to be absorbed in the brass polishing at the coconut shy. He was a stout man with a tendency to perspire in all weathers, and had now achieved a shine that might have satisfied a sergeant major. "Mr. Larch," Hargreaves called. Larch started, wiped his handkerchief across his brow, and trudged over. "You spoke with Mr. Harrow by the gramophone?" Larch swallowed. "Briefly. We were to discuss the committee's order, 2 barrels for the harvest dance. He said he'd meet me behind the tents to avoid interruptions, said he wished to be quick about it. But I went for a penny's worth of humbugs, and when I came back, well—" He gestured vaguely at the terrible fact at their feet. "And you didn't see him go behind the tents?" Miss Marple asked, in the small, interested voice of one who likes arrangements to be tidy. "No, miss," Larch replied. "I only had his word he'd be there. I wouldn't have missed him for a humbug otherwise." "Words," Miss Marple murmured, "are sometimes humbugs in themselves." A breeze lifted the tent flap, and for an instant there was a glimpse of dim interior. Velvet drape, clustered cards, a painted table with a crescent moon rubbed pale at the edge. Something else caught Miss Marple's attention. Along the guy rope, near the pegged end, a bit of thread clung, scarlet against the pale cord, as if some garment had left a whisper of itself behind. She did not stoop to pluck it. It would be better, she knew, if someone official did that. Instead, she followed the rope with her eyes to where the grass bent in that narrow crease, and then to the shoe with its clinging petal. "Constable," she said gently, "do forgive an old woman's curiosity, but in my garden I found that petals cling to damp surfaces much more eagerly than to dry, and blood, I am afraid, is rather damp. One wonders which it touched first." Hargreaves looked at her, grateful and a little baffled. He bent again, peered, and frowned in the laborious way of a man forming a thought in unfamiliar territory. Major Penrose, gratified to find something to pursue, took out a notebook and wrote, "Petal, shoe, blood," as if the hyphens would oblige the items to connect. Around them the fair resumed, but with a muffled quality, like a fete held during a thunderstorm one hopes will pass. A few brave souls bought cakes and threw half-heartedly at coconuts, and the gramophone, after a tactful silence, began to turn again, the waltz now a shade too jaunty for the hour. Miss Marple listened to its thin, cheerful insistence and thought, not unkindly, that human nature is terribly anxious to supply sound in any silence that might otherwise fill with truth. They were still considering the petal when Tom Burrows returned at a run, breathless with importance. "Found him, sir," he panted. "Stanley Briggs is by the river. Says he never went near the fortune-teller again. But he's got a cut on his hand, sir, and he won't say how he did it." He swallowed, dazzled by his own report. "And the fortune-teller says she saw a gentleman behind her tent earlier, a gentleman with a limp." Mr. Waring's stick, planted firmly in the turf, made a small, betraying tremor. Miss Marple, who had been watching the crease in the grass, allowed her eyes to drift up and settle upon the old man with a politeness so complete it hid her scrutiny as neatly as clouds hide the sun. The constable's head turned sharply toward Mr. Waring, who, feeling the sudden pressure of eyes upon him, bristled like an affronted tomcat. He rapped his stick once against the ground, the sound echoing too loud, so too firm. "Now see here," he said, his voice trembling with the outrage of a man who fears discovery more than insult. "I've been lame these 20 years. If someone saw a limp, it proves nothing except that half the men over 60 are guilty of it." Miss Marple's expression was one of gentle sympathy. "Quite true," she agreed. "So many little physical resemblances can lead to confusion. People often forget that a limp, like a cough, can be imitated, sometimes even unconsciously." Mr. Waring glared, uncertain whether he'd been defended or accused. Before he could decide, Hargreaves cleared his throat. "We'll speak with you presently, sir, if you don't mind. Just a few formalities." The constable's politeness had gained an edge. He was beginning to feel his authority in the presence of witnesses. Miss Marple, however, was not watching Waring. Her eyes had strayed once more to Felicity Harrow, who had withdrawn to a chair near the tea urn that Mrs. Bantry had thoughtfully ordered brought over. The young widow, if indeed she was a widow yet, sat rigidly, her face an arrangement of composure, the cup in her hand quite untouched. Major Penrose hovered beside her, speaking in tones of firm reassurance. Yet Miss Marple observed how his hand, resting for a moment on the back of her chair, lingered just a breath too long. "I always say," Miss Marple murmured to no one in particular, "grief has many forms, but gratitude is rarely among them." Dolly Bantry, who had been fussing about with a plate of scones, looked at her friend sharply. "Jane, really?" But Miss Marple only smiled. "Dear Dolly, I was thinking of that nice story in the Book of Ruth. Loyalty after loss, you know. So touching." Dolly, who knew from experience that Miss Marple's biblical references tended to conceal a good deal of worldly speculation, wisely said no more. At that moment, young Tom returned again, dragging a red-faced Stanley Briggs behind him. Stanley's hand was clumsily wrapped in a stained handkerchief, his expression torn between fear and indignation. "I never touched him," he burst out before anyone had spoken. "You can't prove otherwise. I didn't even go near the tents again, I swear it." Hargreaves gestured for calm. "No one's accusing you yet. But you've a cut hand, and there's been talk of words between you and the fortune-teller." Stanley flushed deeper. "A row, that's all. She tried to cheat me, said she could see travel in my future if I paid another 6pence. I told her I'd travel her card straight into the mud if she didn't refund it. She laughed, that's all. I walked off. Caught my hand on the edge of a crate when I passed the coconut stall. Ask Tom if you don't believe me." Tom nodded uncertainly. "Could have happened, sir. There were crates stacked all along the back." Miss Marple studied the boy with mild interest. His eyes met hers, defensive, but there was no guile there, only youth and fear of being misunderstood. She inclined her head ever so slightly as if to say she believed him, and he relaxed at once. "Mr. Waring," said Hargreaves, turning now to the older man, "I'd like your account of your movements, if you please." "My movements? Good heavens, Constable. I've hardly moved in 20 years. I took a turn about the green before luncheon, half a turn, really, and sat near the bandstand to rest. You may ask Mrs. Price Ridley, who complained I was blocking her view of the raffle. Mrs. Price Ridley, who was never one to resist a public statement, nodded vigorously. Quite true. He sat there until nearly 3:30. Then I left for the cake stall, and what he did afterward I couldn't say. 3:30, repeated Hargreaves. And the body was found. What time, Miss Bantry? About 10 minutes to 4 by my watch, Dolly said promptly. So that leaves 20 minutes unaccounted for, murmured Miss Marple, so softly it might have been part of the breeze. Mr. Waring shot her a look of mingled irritation and unease. I may have gone toward the fortune-teller's tent myself, Constable, he said stiffly. Pure curiosity. I fancied she could tell me whether this blasted knee would ever mend. She wasn't there when I arrived. I waited a few minutes and then left. I saw no one. A very reasonable account, Miss Marple said kindly. Though I'm afraid knees, like consciences, seldom mend by prophecy. There was a murmur of uneasy laughter from the gathering. The tension in the air began to settle, though only a little. Hargreaves, satisfied for the moment, began to take notes, and the villagers, who had been crowding forward as stealthily as cats, drifted closer again. The fair had become a kind of living courtroom, each participant eager to witness guilt bloom upon another's face. Miss Marple, standing just outside the crowd, felt the subtle shift in atmosphere that always accompanied the first flush of suspicion. The village was changing shape, an invisible web tightening around certain names, certain looks. And then, quite without warning, the fortune-teller herself appeared. Madame Zora, as her painted sign proclaimed her, swept out from behind the tent like a gust of wind released from a bottle. Her crimson shawl glittered with beads, her dark eyes flashing beneath layers of kohl. Yet the grandeur faltered at the edges. Her hands trembled as they clutched the shawl closed. "You people look at me as if I had done it," she cried, her accent uncertain, part London, part performance. "I saw nothing, you hear. Only that man, the one with the limp, behind my tent, and a little while later, a shadow passed, and then there was shouting." "Did you recognize the shadow?" Hargreaves asked. Her eyes darted. "No, it was tall, that is all. It moved quickly. Perhaps 2 people, I'm not sure. And there was something, a smell of smoke or spirits, I cannot say which." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the beer tent, where Mr. Larch still stood wiping his brow. Spirits indeed, she thought mildly. The constable thanked Madame Zora and promised to take her statement later. The woman retreated, but not before casting a nervous glance toward Felicity Harrow, who met it with a look so coldly civil that Miss Marple felt a small thrill of recognition. That glance, she thought, was not born of fear, but of history. When the body was finally carried away, covered now, decency restored as much as the circumstance allowed, the fair slowly dissolved into uneasy fragments. Families drifted homeward, their voices pitched low. The gramophone had been silenced at last. Miss Marple lingered as the constable packed up his notes and the last of the cake stall was dismantled. The grass beneath the fortune-teller's tent was already showing the bruises of trampling. She stooped delicately and examined the ground where the crease had been. It was deeper now, the mark of feet retracing steps. "Funny," she murmured, "how people always go back to the scene of their mistakes, like watering a flower that will never bloom." "Jane," said Dolly, coming up beside her, "you look as though you've seen through everyone already. Don't tell me you know who did it." Miss Marple smiled, the faintest, most unreadable curve of lips. "My dear Dolly," she said, "one should never decide too soon. Motives are like bulbs. You must plant them in patience and wait to see which sprout in the dark." As they walked home along the lane, the cherry blossoms stirred in the soft evening breeze, drifting like snowflakes across the grass. Somewhere behind them, near the empty fairground, a dog began to bark, once, twice, and then fell silent. And though Miss Marple said nothing, her thoughts were already arranging themselves neatly into questions. Why had Mr. Harrow gone behind the tent? What business had drawn him from the crowd? Who among them had known he would go and waited there first? The answers, she knew, would come. They always did, if one listened long enough to human nature's quiet confessions. By the following morning, the cherry blossom fair seemed an oddly distant memory. The bunting still fluttered from the lamp-posts, but the colors looked faded now, the cheerful remnants of something that had soured overnight. Rain had fallen during the early hours, flattening the grass on the village green and smudging the chalk marks where the fortune-teller's tent had stood. The murder of Mr. Leonard Harrow had turned St. Mary Mead into a hive of hushed excitement. The villagers moved about their errands with the furtive energy of bees guarding gossip instead of honey. Miss Marple sat by her parlor window, knitting in hand, her tea cooling unnoticed beside her. The rain had left the air fresh and full of possibility, an atmosphere, she thought, that lent itself to clear thinking. She had seen murders before, of course. Human beings, like roses, often carried the seeds of destruction in their loveliest blooms. But this particular affair unsettled her. Not because of the violence, though that was dreadful enough, but because of the curious neatness of it all. The knife wound had been precise, almost surgical. There was no sign of struggle, no chaos, only the strange, quiet finality of a life neatly ended. At 10:30, a knock came at the door. It was Dolly Bantry, wrapped in a raincoat the color of porridge, her hat slightly askew from the wind. "Jane, my dear, I'm simply bursting. They say the police have been questioning everyone since dawn. Felicity Harrow hasn't left her house, and Major Penrose has been seen going in and out like a man chasing his own tail. The whole village is alive with talk." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "And what is the talk, dear?" Dolly dropped into a chair, shaking off her umbrella. "Half of them think it was that dreadful fortune-teller. The other half swear it must be Mr. Waring, and a few, of course, have decided it was poor Stanley Briggs, because when you can't understand a thing, you might as well blame a boy." "Quite," said Miss Marple, and her needles clicked softly. Though boys are rarely tidy enough for such crimes. There was nothing impulsive about that wound. "Good heavens, Jane," Dolly said, leaning forward. "You've thought about it already." "I find one does, when something puzzles one. The mind must be allowed to tidy itself, like a work basket after sewing. Otherwise the loose ends tangle." Dolly gave her a fondly exasperated look. "You do make murder sound like embroidery." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "There are similarities. The pattern is always clearer from the back if one looks carefully." Before Dolly could reply, a brisk knock interrupted them. Constable Hargreaves stood on the doorstep, cap in hand, rain beating on his shoulders. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry," he said respectfully. "Thought you might wish to know the inquest's to be held tomorrow. Dr. Haywood's finished the examination. Says the wound was clean through the heart. Knife about 4 inches long, blade narrow. We've yet to find it." "Not found?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "No, ma'am. We've searched the tents, the grass, even the rubbish barrels. Nothing. Either the killer took it or—" He hesitated. "Or someone cleverer than usual disposed of it before we thought to look," Miss Marple finished. "And what of poor Mrs. Harrow?" Hargreaves shifted uneasily. "She's keeping to herself. Major Penrose has been looking in on her. She's a strong one, though. No hysterics. Says she wants to make the funeral arrangements as soon as she's permitted. We'll have to question her again today." Dolly raised her brows. "And Mr. Waring?" "Protested innocence until I nearly believed him. But that limp—" Hargreaves shook his head. Madame Zora swore it was him she saw behind the tent. Then again, her stories change like weather. I've asked Inspector Cray from Melchester to come down this afternoon. I'll be glad of a proper head on the matter. Miss Marple's eyes brightened just slightly. Inspector Cray. I remember him. A very polite man, though inclined to believe in fingerprints when human nature would do. The constable, uncertain whether this was praise or criticism, touched his cap and withdrew. Dolly let out a long sigh. It's dreadful, Jane. Dreadful. A man killed in broad daylight, and all of us so near we could have seen it if we'd only turned our heads. Do you suppose the murderer planned it all along? Miss Marple set her knitting aside and looked thoughtfully out at the wet garden, where a robin hopped across the path with neat precision. I think, she said slowly, that someone planned something else and found murder instead. Accidents of intention, dear Dolly, are often more deliberate than they appear. By late afternoon, Inspector Cray arrived from Melchester. A tall man with a patient manner, he greeted Miss Marple with a respect that was not untinged by wariness. He had crossed paths with her before, and though he would never admit it publicly, she had outpaced him more than once. Miss Marple, he said, bowing slightly, I'm told you were at the fair when the tragedy occurred. Perhaps you observed something the rest of us missed. Only what one always observes, she replied, her tone as mild as the tea she offered him, people behaving rather more like themselves than they mean to. Cray smiled thinly. Quite. Our preliminary findings point to a personal motive. Mr. Harrow, it seems, had been involved in certain, financial irregularities. His brewery shares were under dispute, and there's talk of debts. Debts can be so inconvenient, Miss Marple murmured, especially when one's reputation depends on their secrecy. Indeed, said the inspector. His wife stands to inherit a tidy sum, but only if his death is ruled accidental or unsolved. And Major Penrose, it seems, had been advancing her small loans now and then, purely friendly, of course. Dolly gasped. You don't mean Felicity and the Major? Oh, but surely not. Miss Marple looked down into her teacup, as if the dregs might spell the answer. I think, she said, that we mustn't forget Mr. Waring's limp, or Madame Zora's clever tongue. People tell lies for all sorts of reasons, Inspector. Out of guilt, out of fear, and sometimes out of vanity. The trick is knowing which is which. Cray inclined his head. I'll remember that, Miss Marple. In the meantime, we'll continue questioning. When he had gone, Dolly turned to her friend in frustration. Jane, why don't you simply tell him what you think? You always know before anyone else. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes still on the rain-streaked window. Because, dear, it's ever so much more instructive to let people talk themselves into knots. One learns a great deal from what's said, and even more from what's tidied away. Outside, the church bell struck 5, and a gust of wind sent a flurry of damp petals skittering across the lane. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Shall we pay a call on poor Mrs. Harrow? It's only kind to offer condolences, and kindness, I've found, opens far more doors than questions. Dolly hesitated, then nodded. Very well, Jane. But I've a dreadful feeling you're not going to see her only for kindness. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. One must never do anything for only one reason, dear. It spoils the effect. And with that, the two ladies set out through the fading light, the scent of wet cherry blossoms following them like a whisper from the day before. Soft, sweet, and hiding something quietly rotten beneath its bloom. Felicity Harrow's cottage lay at the edge of the village, its windows glowing faintly against the encroaching dusk. A delicate mist was rising from the meadows beyond, turning the hedgerows into soft silhouettes. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approached, the faint chiming of a clock drifted through the still air. The sound had a melancholy rhythm, as though time itself was keeping vigil for the dead. Dolly tugged her coat tighter. It feels different here, she murmured. Still, I suppose grief always leaves a sort of hush about a place. Are you sure she'll want visitors, Jane? People rarely want visitors, Miss Marple said quietly, but they nearly always need them. Besides, I have the feeling Mrs. Harrow is more accustomed to keeping appearances than avoiding them. The door was opened by a maid in a stiff apron, young, pale, and clearly uncertain whether to admit them. When Miss Marple mentioned their errand of condolence, she nodded hastily and led them through a narrow hall, fragrant with lilies. The drawing-room beyond was tastefully arranged, though its order seemed almost too deliberate, as if the very cushions had been composed to disguise unrest. Felicity Harrow sat near the fire, her morning dress of dove grey a shade too refined for the occasion. She rose as they entered, her expression politely blank. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple. How kind of you to come. I've had such a dreadful morning with the inspector and reporters. I confess I feel quite wrung out." Dolly advanced, all sympathy and rustling skirts. "My dear, we wouldn't dream of intruding long. We simply thought you mustn't be alone with such a burden. Everyone's speaking of you with the greatest concern." Felicity gave a thin smile. "I can imagine what they're speaking. I've lived here long enough to know that sympathy and speculation are always served together." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently, taking a chair near the hearth. "Villages are like teapots, Mrs. Harrow, always boiling but never spilling over entirely. One must learn to let the steam escape safely." A faint flicker passed through Felicity's eyes, something between amusement and irritation. "You have a gift for expression, Miss Marple. I only wish I could find anything humorous in my situation." "I wasn't being humorous, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "But I have often found that tragedy behaves best when treated as though it were a troublesome child. Ignore it, and it makes mischief." Dolly, who never quite knew how her friend's analogies would end, hurried to change the subject. "How dreadful it all is. To think such a thing could happen in broad daylight, at the fair of all places." Felicity's hands, folded neatly in her lap, tightened just slightly. Yes, it was monstrous. Leonard was difficult at times, but no one deserved this. She turned her gaze toward the fire, her expression softening. He was fond of order, of keeping accounts exact. That was his pride, though it made him enemies in business. Perhaps too many. Miss Marple watched her closely. "I've always thought men of precision live rather dangerously, Mrs. Harrow. When one insists on rules, one inevitably steps on toes." Felicity's tone chilled. "You think he was killed over business, then?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that men rarely die for business alone. Pride and affection, jealousy and embarrassment, they mix in like the spice in a pudding. Sometimes one scarcely notices them until the taste is quite altered." Dolly gave a nervous laugh. "Jane has such a way of putting things. Tell me, Mrs. Harrow, have you seen much of Major Penrose today? He was so distraught yesterday." Felicity looked up swiftly. "The Major has been very good, very kind. He knew Leonard from the Officers' Club years ago, before the war. He's helped me with arrangements. The inspector spoke to him, of course, but he was nowhere near the tent when it happened." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested quietly in her lap. She did not take out her needles, but one hand brushed the soft wool absently, as if her fingers were following a familiar pattern. "It's curious," she said after a moment, "how kindness so often arrives before one has asked for it. The Major must be a very intuitive man." Felicity hesitated, then smiled faintly. "He's a gentleman, Miss Marple. In times of distress, one is grateful for such friends." There was a small silence. The clock on the mantel ticked evenly, a tiny metronome of civility. Then Miss Marple rose. "We mustn't tire you, but before we go, might I ask, did your husband often go to the fair? I can't recall having seen him there before." "He disliked such things," Felicity said at once. "He only came because the committee insisted. There was to be some agreement signed with Mr. Larch, something to do with the brewery. It was tiresome business, really." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, He chose the fortune-teller's tent for his meeting place. An odd spot for business, don't you think? Felicity blinked. Yes, I suppose it is. But Leonard had a sense of humor, you see. He enjoyed doing the unexpected. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Of course. Men who like order often crave a small touch of chaos now and then. She smiled, and Felicity, uncertain whether she was being mocked, inclined her head with a polite murmur. Outside, as they stepped back into the cool evening air, Dolly let out a long breath. Well, Jane, that was the most uncomfortable visit I've ever paid. I don't believe she liked your questions one bit. My dear, said Miss Marple, fastening her coat, I wasn't asking questions. I was letting her ask herself a few. Then what did you make of her? Dolly pressed, half whispering as they passed the gate. Do you think she did it? Miss Marple's gaze followed the curling mist over the hedgerows. I think she's clever enough to be cautious, and cautious enough to seem innocent. But I also think she's frightened of something, or someone, that isn't dead yet. They walked in silence for a few moments, their footsteps muffled on the damp lane. Lamps were being lit in cottage windows, each one a tiny island of domestic peace in the lengthening dusk. When they reached the corner by the post office, Miss Marple paused, glancing toward the river path. Dolly, do go on home without me. I should like to stretch my legs a bit. Jane, it's nearly dark. Darkness, Miss Marple said with a faint smile, has never frightened me half as much as what people do in daylight. Reluctantly, Mrs. Bantry agreed and went her way. Miss Marple turned down the narrow path leading toward the green. The fair ground was empty now, save for a few trampled stalls and the distant creak of the swings moving in the wind. She moved slowly, her eyes drawn toward the place where the fortune-teller's tent had stood. The grass was muddy and uneven. She stooped, peering in the dim light. Something pale caught her attention, a scrap of paper pressed into the mud. She lifted it delicately with her gloved hand. It was the torn corner of an envelope, faintly embossed with a crest that she recognized from the letterhead Major Penrose had used when writing to the village committee. Miss Marple straightened, the mist curling around her ankles like smoke. She slipped the fragment into her pocket and murmured softly to herself. Now why, I wonder, should a gentleman's correspondence end up at the scene of a tradesman's death? Then, hearing the faint crunch of footsteps behind her, she turned, smiling pleasantly as though she had expected company all along. The figure emerging from the mist was not a stranger. Major Penrose, hat pulled low, appeared almost startled to find Miss Marple standing there, her posture composed, her expression one of polite curiosity. The faint smell of cigar smoke clung to him, sharp against the damp air. Miss Marple, he said, recovering quickly, forgive me if I gave you a fright. I didn't expect anyone to be about this evening. Ghastly business, isn't it? I've been unable to sleep. Oh, not at all, Miss Marple replied pleasantly, though I must say one usually sleeps better when one's conscience is quiet. He gave a short, uneasy laugh. Indeed, my conscience, I assure you, is entirely at rest. I was merely thinking, these things unsettle a man. Yes, she said, her eyes meeting his in the half-light. Murder often does. He looked away quickly. The inspector asked me to look over the fairground one last time before the rain washes away any trace. I served with the intelligence corps once, you know. He seems to think I have an eye for detail. How very public-spirited, Miss Marple said, stepping aside as he approached. And did your examination yield anything of interest? He hesitated, glancing toward the trampled grass. Nothing concrete, though I can't help but wonder what a man like Harrow was doing here at all. He wasn't the sort to mingle with fortune-tellers and villagers. You'd have thought he had better things to do. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, but business and curiosity have lured many a man to strange places. Even an officer might wander where he's not expected. Penrose frowned faintly at that, but said nothing. He bent to inspect the ground, his boot pressing into the same patch where Miss Marple had found the envelope corner moments earlier. The faint outline of his tread smudged the impression she'd been studying. She watched him with mild interest, the way a naturalist might observe a rare insect. After a moment, he straightened. It's no good. The rain's ruined any hope of finding prints. Still, I suppose Hargreaves will insist on posting a constable here tonight. Quite unnecessary, if you ask me. The killer's long gone. Oh, do you think so? Miss Marple asked gently. I rather fancy he, or she, may still be quite near. Murderers are a bit like gardeners, Major. They often return to see if their work has taken root. He looked at her sharply, his composure tightening. You have a morbid imagination, Miss Marple. Not imagination, she said. Experience. For a brief moment, they stood in silence. Then the Major tipped his hat with a forced smile. You'll forgive me, but I must be getting along. Mrs. Harrow may need my help with tomorrow's arrangements. Good evening. Miss Marple watched him stride away, the mist swallowing his figure until only the rhythmic tap of his cane remained. When it faded, she turned her attention back to the patch of ground. The faint glimmer of moisture on the mud caught her eye. The impression of something small and round, pressed near the edge of the tent's former footprint. She bent low, retrieving a button of dark horn, scratched faintly at the back where a thread had snapped. Tucking it beside the torn paper in her pocket, she murmured, A gentleman's coat, of course, and how careless to leave one's details scattered about the scene. By the next morning, word had spread that Inspector Cray had ordered a fresh round of interviews. The village buzzed again like a disturbed hive, everyone with theories that grew wilder as the day went on. Miss Marple heard them all as she walked toward the vicarage for tea, Mrs. Price Ridley insisting the fortune-teller was part of a foreign crime ring, Miss Hartnell declaring it was obviously an affair of jealousy, and Mr. Larch, red-faced and sweating, muttering that the police ought to look closer at those who wear uniforms and think they own the place. At the vicarage, Inspector Cray was already waiting, his notebook open. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod that mixed deference and caution. Ah, Miss Marple, I was just coming to find you. I thought it might be useful to hear your impressions. You do have a way of noticing the smaller things. She sat opposite him, folding her hands neatly. One does one's best. Have you made progress? Cray sighed. If progress means ruling out what didn't happen, yes. The fortune-teller's story is inconsistent, but there's no evidence she handled the knife. Mr. Waring's limp alibi holds. Half the village saw him sitting before the bandstand. And Mrs. Harrow, well, grief makes people strange, but I can't imagine she'd stab her husband in public. People often imagine the wrong things, Miss Marple said softly. Grief, guilt, and relief are difficult to distinguish in their early stages. The inspector gave her a wry look. Then who do you suspect? Oh, I don't suspect, Inspector. I observe. I've noticed, for instance, that Major Penrose has a most unmilitary habit of avoiding direct answers, and that Mrs. Harrow's sorrow lacks the irregularities of real emotion. It's too tidy, like a well-kept ledger. Then there's the curious matter of Mr. Harrow himself, a man said to be honest in business, yet apparently deep in debt. I wonder who was his creditor. Cray's eyes sharpened. You think there's a financial link? I think money is rarely absent where motives grow thick, Miss Marple replied. But of course, debts are not only counted in coin. There are other kinds, emotional, moral, romantic. Some are far deadlier. Before the inspector could respond, the vicar's housekeeper entered, her cheeks flushed. Beg pardon, sir, but Constable Hargreaves has just come from the Harrow place. There's been a break-in. Cray stood abruptly. When? Not half an hour ago. Mrs. Harrow's safe was forced. Papers scattered all about. She says nothing's missing, but she's in quite a state. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes grew thoughtful. Papers scattered, you say? How interesting. Thieves usually take things, not rearrange them. I think perhaps the thief was looking for something quite specific and hoped Mrs. Harrow wouldn't notice its absence. Cray grabbed his coat. "You'd best stay here, Miss Marple." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of intruding," she said with mild amusement, rising as well. "Still, if you should find a missing letter, do be careful how you handle it. Paper can cut as sharply as knives." By the time they reached the Harrow cottage, the lane was alive with murmurs again. Felicity stood in the doorway, pale but composed, a shawl drawn close about her shoulders. Major Penrose was beside her, his expression grim, his hand resting lightly on her arm. Inside, drawers stood open, the writing desk overturned. Miss Marple's eyes moved quietly over the scene. There, near the hearth, lay a small heap of ashes, the remnants of something recently burned. Felicity's voice trembled just slightly. "It was dreadful, Inspector. I'd gone upstairs for barely 10 minutes. When I came down, the window latch was broken and everything in disarray." "Nothing missing?" Cray asked. "Nothing I can see." Miss Marple bent near the ashes, her hand hovering above them. "How strange," she said softly. "Such fresh ashes, and from fine stationery, too. It's a pity someone destroyed what they feared we might find. People so rarely realize how much more revealing ashes can be than words." Major Penrose's hand tightened on Felicity's arm. "Surely, Miss Marple, you don't mean—" But Miss Marple only smiled, her eyes never leaving the faint curl of smoke rising from the hearth. "Oh, my dear Major," she said gently, "I rarely mean anything. But human nature, well, it always does." The faint smoke from the burned papers curled upward and disappeared into the chimney, leaving behind only a bitter, acrid scent. Miss Marple's eyes followed its path, calm and steady, as though she could read the remnants of the destroyed documents in the air itself. Inspector Cray crouched beside the hearth, sifting gently through the ashes with the tip of his pencil. "Mostly paper by the look of it," he said. "No metal clasps or sealing wax, nothing of value." "Value," Miss Marple said quietly, "is such a curious thing, Inspector. Some would burn a fortune in notes to conceal a penny's worth of shame." Major Penrose gave a strained laugh. "You don't think this was anything so theatrical, surely? Mrs. Harrow told you herself. She doesn't even know what was in the safe. Her husband handled all that." Felicity's eyes darted toward him, a flicker of unease in her otherwise composed face. "Leonard kept his papers private," she said. "Business dealings, contracts. I never interfered." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to her with delicate curiosity. "You must have trusted him very deeply, my dear. That's admirable. Of course, trust can be so much like sleep, can't it? Comforting until one wakes to find something missing." Felicity stiffened. "I suppose you mean to suggest I was blind. But a wife must have faith in her husband." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Oh, indeed, only faith, like money, can sometimes be invested poorly." Before Felicity could respond, Cray straightened and gestured toward the open desk. "There's one drawer untouched," he said, "locked tight. May I have your permission to open it, Mrs. Harrow?" Felicity hesitated. "If you think it necessary." The inspector produced a small pick from his pocket, and within a moment the drawer gave way with a metallic click. Inside lay a collection of personal letters, all neatly tied with blue ribbon. Miss Marple watched as Cray untied the bundle. The first few pages were harmless enough, receipts, correspondence about the brewery. But then his brow furrowed. "These aren't business papers," he murmured. "They're personal letters. From you, Major." The room went still. Penrose's expression hardened, though a faint flush crept into his cheeks. "Old letters," he said firmly. "Nothing improper. Leonard and I shared a friendship, and I often corresponded with them both during the war." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with mild surprise. "How loyal of you, Major, though I do notice the dates on those envelopes are rather more recent than the war. Last year, in fact." The Major's jaw tightened. "You're implying something, Miss Marple." "Implying? No, dear. I never imply. It's such a dangerous habit. People are apt to fill in the blanks one never meant to draw. Cray carefully replaced the letters. Whatever their content, they may shed light on motive. Mr. Harrow might not have appreciated another man's attention to his wife. Felicity's composure cracked at that. No, you misunderstand entirely. The Major was a friend. Leonard knew that. He wouldn't have... She stopped, faltering, her breath catching on the half-formed protest. Miss Marple finished softly. He wouldn't have objected. My dear, men are most unpredictable in jealousy, particularly those who seem above it. The quieter the man, the louder his pride when betrayed. Felicity turned away, her hand trembling on the back of a chair. You think you know everything, don't you? But you don't. You have no idea what it was like being married to him. There was a moment of silence. Even Inspector Cray seemed reluctant to speak. Miss Marple broke it with a tone so gentle it almost sounded like sympathy. Perhaps you should tell us, my dear. It may help to understand what led him here yesterday, to the fair, to that tent, and to his death. Felicity looked from one to the other, then sank into the chair by the window. The rain outside had begun again, fine and steady. Leonard was proud, she said finally, and secretive. Everything had to appear perfect. The house, the accounts, me, especially me. He couldn't bear anyone thinking his wife less than an ornament. If I spoke to another man too long, there'd be questions later. Cold questions, the sort that freeze you from the inside. She glanced briefly at the Major, whose gaze remained fixed on the floor. He was angry when the Major began visiting, suspicious. I told him it was harmless, but he wouldn't believe me. Cray leaned forward. Did he ever threaten you? Her lips pressed together. Not in so many words, but he made it clear he could ruin me socially, cut off my allowance, send me back to my brother's house. He said a woman's reputation is like crystal, one crack, and everyone sees it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, she said quietly. Men of that sort seldom realize how fragile their own reputations are, and I suppose yesterday something forced him to see his reflection too clearly. Felicity shook her head. I don't know. He said he had business to attend to. He left me near the Punch and Judy show. That was the last I saw of him alive. Cray nodded slowly, closing his notebook. We'll leave you to rest for now, Mrs. Harrow, but I'll have to take those letters for examination. As he gathered the papers, Miss Marple moved closer to the hearth once more. The faintest glint caught her eye among the ashes. A sliver of metal, half melted but still recognizable. She bent, picking it up carefully with a handkerchief. It was the fragment of a seal, shaped like a crest. The same crest embossed on the scrap of envelope she had found the night before. When they stepped outside into the damp air, Cray turned to her. You saw something in there. What is it? Miss Marple tucked the handkerchief into her reticule. Only what was burned, Inspector. The Major's crest, broken and half melted. You see, the letters weren't the only thing linking him to Mr. Harrow. Cray frowned. You think the Major killed him? I think, she said, that the Major may have wanted to protect something more than his pride, but whether it was Mrs. Harrow or himself, I've yet to be sure. People so often destroy evidence in the name of love, and yet love itself is the most incriminating evidence of all. They walked in silence down the lane, the mist thickening once more. A horse-drawn cart rattled past, its wheels leaving deep grooves in the mud. Miss Marple paused at the corner, glancing back toward the Harrow cottage. A light still burned in the window, a faint golden square against the gray. She turned toward the inspector. Tell me, did you notice how Mrs. Harrow spoke of her husband's pride, but never once of affection? That absence, Inspector, is often where the truth begins. Cray nodded, his expression grave. Then where do we look next? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly in the fading light. The fair may be over, but its prizes remain. Someone kept a souvenir from that day, a knife, perhaps, or a letter that never should have been written. We must find who still treasures it. For love and guilt, you see, have the same habit. They never quite let go. The next morning dawned cold and thin, with a pale light filtering through low clouds that seemed to press down on the roofs of St. Mary Mead. The village, though outwardly calm, was vibrating with curiosity beneath the surface. Every doorstep, every shop counter carried the hum of whispered speculation. Miss Marple, walking quietly toward the green, felt the familiar pulse of rumor moving like an underground current through the lanes. She had seen it often before, how tragedy awakened something restless in small communities, how grief became a form of theater in the mouths of those untouched by it. Inspector Cray met her near the vicarage gate, his expression grim and sleepless. "Miss Marple," he said by way of greeting, "we've just had the coroner's preliminary report. The wound was made by a narrow-bladed knife, 4 inches long, thrust upward with considerable precision. Likely someone who knew exactly where to strike. There's something else, too. The doctor believes the victim had been drinking heavily before he died. A strong smell of spirits was noted." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Ah, yes, that would account for his stillness, wouldn't it? A man softened by alcohol rarely expects danger until it's already behind him." Cray frowned. "You think the drink was deliberate? Perhaps he met his killer to settle something?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that people often fortify themselves before a confrontation, especially when they mean to confess or accuse. I wonder which Mr. Harrow intended." They walked together across the damp grass toward the remnants of the fairground. The fortune-teller's tent had been taken down, leaving only a ring of flattened daisies and a faint smell of paraffin from the torches. At the edge of the green, old Mr. Waring was standing with his walking stick, peering down at the ground as though hoping it would yield an answer. When he saw them, he gave a stiff nod. "Inspector." "Miss Marple. A sorry affair, this. Never thought I'd see murder in St. Mary Mead. It's not decent, that's what it is. Not decent at all." "Quite so, Mr. Waring," Miss Marple said kindly. "Though I imagine you've seen a good deal of indecency in your day, if the stories about your time in India are true." Waring gave a bark of laughter, his irritation forgotten. "India, yes. And worse besides. Still, I tell you, what's happened here, it wasn't some foreign villainy. It's one of our own. You can always tell when something's homegrown. The quietness of it, the neatness." He tapped his stick in the mud. "Mark my words. The one who did it walks these lanes still." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I entirely agree, Mr. Waring, but tell me, do you recall seeing Mr. Harrow before the fair began? I believe you said you were resting near the bandstand." The old man squinted. "Aye, I saw him pass once. Alone, brisk as you please, though he looked put out about something. 10 minutes later, that fortune-teller woman came round, the back of her tent, muttering to herself. After that, I saw the Major. Limping, yes, though trying to hide it. He walked toward the same place Mr. Harrow had gone. I thought nothing of it till after." He broke off and shrugged. "You can't go accusing a man just for walking, can you?" "No," Miss Marple said softly, "but one can note the order of their steps." As they left Waring by the path, Cray turned to her. "You're thinking of the Major again." "I'm thinking," she said, "of what men do when pride and pity live too near each other. The Major is protecting someone, perhaps Mrs. Harrow, perhaps himself. But it wasn't merely sentiment that brought him to the tent that day. Something drew him there, a letter perhaps, or an ultimatum." "An ultimatum?" "Oh, yes. I dare say Mr. Harrow discovered the correspondence we found yesterday. I suspect he meant to use it for advantage. Men who crave control rarely forgive an embarrassment. I imagine he sent for the Major to make his point." Cray rubbed his chin. "And then one of them snapped." "Or both did," Miss Marple said. "You see, murder is rarely tidy, Inspector. Even when the knife is, there's always more than one hand guiding the blade. Sometimes literally, sometimes not." They had reached the lane when Dolly Bantry appeared. breathless and flushed from exertion. "Jane, Inspector, you must come at once. There's been another shock, at the Harrow place again. The maid, Clara, found something under the drawing-room rug this morning while sweeping. A blood stain." Within 10 minutes, they were back at the cottage. Felicity Harrow stood by the window, pale but composed, her fingers worrying the edge of a handkerchief. "I told her not to move it," she said faintly. "I thought it best to send for you directly." The inspector knelt to lift the rug. Beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was a rusty smear, the color of dried blood, just at the edge of the carpet near the writing desk. Cray straightened slowly. "So," he said, "the murder weapon wasn't the only thing cleaned up after all. Someone tried to scrub this." Felicity looked horrified. "But that means it happened here, in this room." Miss Marple's eyes wandered toward the hearth, to the ashes still faintly grey from yesterday's fire. "Not necessarily here, my dear. Blood is a very persistent thing. It clings to cloth, to shoes, to conscience. A man might walk half a mile and still carry his guilt with him." She stepped closer, her gaze drifting to the corner near the umbrella stand. "Inspector, may I trouble you to look behind there?" Cray obliged, crouching down. A moment later, he pulled out a small object, half buried beneath a scattering of dried petals. It was a pocket knife, its blade narrow, its handle polished smooth with use. Dried rust dulled the steel. Cray let out a low whistle. "Well, Miss Marple, you may have just handed me the Idern murder weapon." Felicity swayed slightly, gripping the mantle. "That's Leonard's," she whispered. "His father's old knife. He kept it in his desk drawer, always. I don't understand." Miss Marple regarded her with gentle calm. "Perhaps someone wished to make sure you wouldn't." The inspector wrapped the knife carefully and slipped it into an evidence pouch. "We'll have this examined straight away. But if it was his own knife, then whoever used it either knew where to find it, or was very much at home here." Felicity's lips parted, a breath catching in her throat. "You can't mean—" "No, I didn't—" Miss Marple reached out and touched her arm lightly. "No one has said that, my dear. But secrets have a tiresome habit of slipping through the cracks like dust under doors, and someone, I think, has been sweeping rather too neatly of late." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall again, pattering against the window panes. Inspector Cray turned toward Miss Marple. "You're not surprised we found it?" She smiled faintly. "No. Murderers often think themselves clever for hiding a thing where no one will look, but people rarely search where the truth feels impolite. Behind furniture, beneath rugs. Oh, and inside friendships, Inspector. That's where the worst of it hides." He nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "Then our next visit, I take it, should be to Major Penrose." Miss Marple's eyes met his, sharp and clear. "Yes, but not with questions, Inspector, with sympathy. The guilty reveal themselves far quicker when they think one is trying to forgive them." As they left the cottage, the rain quickened, turning the lane to silver streaks. Miss Marple raised her umbrella, her voice soft beneath the patter. "It's coming to its close now, Inspector. You can feel it in the air, the story tightening like a knot. All we must do is wait for the one who tied it to tug." By late afternoon, the rain had turned steady, silver threads hanging from the sky and blurring the outlines of the cottages. Inspector Cray and Miss Marple walked in silence along the lane that led to the Major's house, their boots crunching over gravel darkened by water. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, the kind of scent that clings to secrets and lingers long after they've been aired. Miss Marple's umbrella tilted slightly as she walked, a small, composed figure in grey, her expression one of thoughtful calm that masked mind whirring like clockwork. Major Penrose's house stood apart from the village, a solid Georgian structure with ivy creeping up its front and a Union Jack folded neatly above the porch. The brass knocker gleamed. Even in mourning, the Major would not permit disorder. When he opened the door, he seemed unsurprised to see them. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed, but his voice held the same clipped politeness as ever. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I thought perhaps you might call. Please do come in. I was just making tea, though I confess it feels more like duty than comfort today." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Tea is the proper response to all things, Major. It steadies the hands, even when the heart won't follow." He led them into a study lined with books and regimental photographs. The fire crackled softly, throwing light on the brass frames. Everything in the room bore the careful order of a man who prized control above sentiment. Yet there was something brittle about the stillness, like a glass too thin to hold the heat. As the Major poured the tea, Cray's voice broke the silence. "We've been at the Harrow house again. A few discoveries, one in particular you may find interesting." Penrose looked up sharply. "Discoveries?" "A knife, Major, a small one. Mr. Harrow's, by his wife's account. We found it hidden behind the drawing-room furniture." The Major's hands did not tremble, but the teapot wavered in mid-air a fraction too long before he set it down. "I see," he said carefully. "Then the case is solved, surely. The killer must have used his own weapon, an argument gone too far, perhaps. We've seen it before." Cray's gaze was steady. "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone used his knife to make it appear so." A muscle moved in Penrose's jaw. "You're implying fabrication." "I'm considering all possibilities," Cray replied evenly. Miss Marple stirred her tea, though she hadn't added sugar. "The curious thing about fabrication, Major, is that it rarely fools those who know the texture of truth. It's like poor mending. You can always see where the new thread doesn't quite match the old." Penrose gave a thin smile. "You're suggesting I've been sewing, Miss Marple?" "Oh, not at all. But you strike me as a man who dislikes untidy seams." For a moment, no one spoke. The ticking of a small clock on the mantel filled the silence, marking each second with gentle insistence. Then the Major said abruptly, "You've both been very thorough, but I fail to see how I can assist you further. I've told you all I know. Harrow was alive when I left him. If you're implying otherwise, I'll ask that you say so plainly." Miss Marple's expression softened. "My dear Major, no one is accusing you. It's only that sometimes people with the best intentions make choices they later regret. A heated word, a gesture of pity mistaken for betrayal. It doesn't take much to change the course of a moment." He looked at her, his face paling further. "You think it was pity?" he said quietly. "I think," she replied, "that men of honor often mistake pity for weakness, and women, unfortunately, mistake it for affection. Between the two, many tragedies are born." Cray leaned forward slightly. "Major, when we searched the Harrow home, we found remnants of burned papers in the fireplace. The fragments bore your family crest. Care to explain how they came to be there?" There was a long pause. Then Penrose drew a slow breath and sat back. "I see. So it comes to that." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small silver cigarette case, running his thumb over it before setting it aside untouched. "Yes, they were mine. Letters. From me to Felicity, and from her to me. Nothing salacious, nothing that would scandalize even the most rigid mind. But her husband was not forgiving. He found one of them. He threatened to expose her to ruin, to make her a spectacle. You know what that meant to a woman like her." Cray's voice was steady. "So you went to the fair to confront him?" Penrose nodded once. "He sent me a note. Said if I didn't come, he'd see to it everyone knew. I went to reason with him. I swear it, I meant only to talk." He rose suddenly, pacing before the fire. He was half drunk already, sneering at me. "Called me a fool," said Felicity laughed at me behind my back. "I turned to go, that's all. When I left him, he was very much alive." Miss Marple watched him closely. and yet you burned the letters afterward." "Yes," he said hoarsely. "When I learned he'd been killed, I panicked. I thought if they were found, they'd condemn her. She's been through enough humiliation." Miss Marple's tone was almost kind. "You've protected her twice now, Major, first from gossip and then from suspicion. But protection, like poison, must be measured carefully. Too much, and it kills the thing one means to save." Penrose's eyes lifted sharply. "You think she did it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that she knows more than she's told, and I think she's clever enough to let you believe you're saving her." Cray's expression hardened. "Major, until we've verified your account, I must ask that you remain here. You'll be escorted to Melchester tomorrow for formal questioning." Penrose gave a short, bitter laugh. "Of course. The gallant fool again. I suppose I've earned it." When they stepped back out into the rain, the sky had darkened further. The first roll of thunder sounded faintly over the hills. Cray turned to Miss Marple. "Do you truly believe she's using him?" Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her face unreadable. "Oh, Inspector, people rarely use one another consciously. They simply lean in the direction of their needs, and others, kind, lonely souls, mistake it for affection. Mrs. Harrow is frightened, yes, but not of discovery. She's frightened of what might still be found." Cray frowned. What else could there be? Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the direction of the Harrow cottage, where a faint light flickered in an upstairs window. "A reason," she said softly. "A reason strong enough for murder. Pride is powerful, but fear of exposure, of the right secret, will always run deeper." The thunder sounded again, closer this time. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on the window's glow as she added, half to herself, "And I believe, Inspector, before the night is done, that reason will come to light, whether by confession or by folly. Human nature never quite resists the urge to show its hand." The thunder had rolled on toward the downs by the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, yet the air still trembled with that uneasy charge that lingers after a storm. Lamps flickered behind lace curtains all through St. Mary Mead, but none burned so late as the one in Miss Marple's parlor. She had not gone to bed. Instead, she sat before her small writing desk, a sheet of notepaper before her, her pen idle. It was not words she sought, but pattern, threads drawn together, the loose ends that people so carelessly left dangling when they lied. Outside, the lane was quiet except for the occasional hiss of rain slipping from the eaves. Then came a sound that did not belong to the weather, a sharp, hurried knock at her door. Miss Marple looked up calmly, though her hand paused just a moment before she rose. Few people called at that hour, and fewer still without cause. When she opened the door, Felicity Harrow stood there. Her grey cloak was soaked through, the hood fallen back, her hair dark with rain. Her face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion and something close to panic. "Miss Marple, may I come in, please? I couldn't think where else to go." "Of course, my dear," said Miss Marple gently, stepping aside. "Sit by the fire. You must be frozen through." Felicity obeyed, hands trembling slightly as she held them toward the warmth. "I heard you'd been to see the Major," she said in a low, unsteady voice. "The inspector's questioning him now, isn't he?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, watching her closely. "He's being very helpful, a most loyal friend." Felicity gave a strained little laugh. "Loyal. Yes, that's what they'll call him. He's loyal enough to hang for me if I let him." Miss Marple did not move. The clock ticked softly, marking the silence that followed. "Do you mean," she said after a moment, "that you intend to let him, my dear?" Felicity looked up sharply, color flooding her cheeks. "No, Miss Marple, I don't know what to do. It's all gone so wrong. I never meant for any of it to happen." "You mean the quarrel with your husband?" Miss Marple said softly. "Or something else that followed it?" Felicity pressed a hand to her mouth. For a moment she seemed to wrestle with the words, but when she spoke, They came out in a rush. Leonard found the letters. He was furious. He said he'd ruin me, ruin the Major too. He wasn't drunk then, not yet. I begged him to be reasonable, but he only laughed at me. Said I'd chosen my punishment. Then he went out. To the fair. I knew he meant to humiliate us both. You followed him? Miss Marple asked gently. Felicity shook her head. No, I couldn't. I was afraid of what I might do if I saw him again. But the Major went after him. I didn't ask him to. He just did. When he came back later that evening, he looked different. Pale, shaken. He wouldn't speak of what had passed, only said it was over and that I must destroy the letters. I thought he meant Leonard had relented. Her voice cracked. It wasn't until the constable came the next morning that I understood. Miss Marple folded her hands, her voice calm and steady. And when you realized, you burned the rest of the letters to protect him. Felicity looked at her in shock. How could you? My dear, it's the natural course of affection. We always think we're saving someone when we're really only delaying the truth. But tell me, when you burned them, did you see the Major again? Yes, later that night. He came to the house. Said the police might find the letters, that it would be my ruin if they did. I was shaking so badly I could hardly speak. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, Don't worry. I'll take the blame if it comes to that. He said it so quietly, so certain. It frightened me more than anything Leonard ever said. Miss Marple's eyes softened. He meant it, of course. Men like the Major are trained to protect. But tell me something, Mrs. Harrow. Was your husband truly as cruel as you make him out to be? Or was it only that he saw through the illusion you and the Major built between you? Felicity's eyes flashed, a spark of something fierce beneath the fear. You don't understand. Leonard despised weakness. He would have destroyed us both out of pride. I only wanted to be free of him. And now, Miss Marple said almost kindly, you are. Felicity froze, her lips parting. You think I killed him? I think, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but implacable, that you found courage too late and used it badly. You went after him, didn't you? Perhaps intending to plead, or to threaten. The quarrel turned ugly. The knife was close to hand. You struck him, and when you saw what you had done, you panicked. Then came the Major, too late to prevent it, but in time to protect you. He hid what he could, took your blame as his own, and you let him. Felicity rose abruptly, her face pale as ash. You can't prove that. You can't know. My dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Proof is rarely necessary. It's not the evidence that betrays us. It's the conscience. You wouldn't have come here tonight unless it had begun to speak. Felicity's composure shattered. She buried her face in her hands, her voice breaking. He called me heartless, said I'd ruin him as I had my husband. But I didn't mean, oh God, I didn't mean to kill Leonard. He caught my wrist, he was shouting. I just wanted him to stop. Miss Marple's hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder. Yes, my dear, I believe you didn't mean to. But one can't unmake a moment once it's begun. The Major did what he thought honorable. It's time you did the same. The door opened suddenly then, and Inspector Cray stepped in, rain dripping from his hat. He froze at the sight before him. Felicity crumpled in the chair, Miss Marple standing calm beside her. Miss Marple turned to him, her expression grave but composed. You're just in time, Inspector. Mrs. Harrow has something she wishes to tell you. Felicity looked up through tears, trembling but resolute. It's true, she whispered. It was me. I killed him. The Major only tried to help me. Please, don't let him suffer for it. Cray stood silently for a moment, then nodded slowly. You've done the right thing, Mrs. Harrow. It will count for something. When she was led away, Miss Marple watched the door close behind her, then turned back to the fire. The flames crackled softly, consuming a new log, sending up small golden sparks that reminded her of the ashes in the Harrow hearth. She sighed faintly and sat again, her knitting untouched beside her. Dolly Bantry arrived not long after dawn, flustered and wide-eyed. "Jane, they say Mrs. Harrow's confessed. Is it true? I can't believe it. Such a quiet creature." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh, quite true, I'm afraid." "Quietness, dear Dolly, is no guarantee of peace. It's often the still water that hides the sharpest stones." Dolly sat, shaking her head. "But to think she fooled us all, and the Major too. He'd have taken the blame." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "He would. But that's the trouble with noble men. They never notice when someone's only using their honor as a shield." The morning sun broke through at last, turning the raindrops on the glass into small sparks of light. Miss Marple watched them with a kind of tired serenity. "It's always sad, you know," she murmured. "Murder never begins in malice. It begins in fear. And fear," she added quietly, "is the one emotion that never tells the truth, not even to itself." Outside, the bells of St. Mary Mead began to ring for the early service, steady and bright, as though nothing had happened at all. Miss Marple folded her hands and smiled faintly. "Well," she said, "I dare say the blossoms will be out again by next year. People do so love a fair." The following morning dawned still and bright, the kind of calm that often follows storms both of weather and of human passion. St. Mary Mead wore again its usual mask of serenity. The village green was empty, the bunting from the cherry blossom fair now fluttering in tatters along the hedgerows. Yet beneath that tranquility lay the faint hum of unease that lingers after tragedy. Gossip spoken softly over fences, curtains drawn just a moment too long. Miss Marple, as ever, appeared unchanged. She sat in her garden with a cup of tea, the faint scent of roses drifting through the morning air. Inspector Cray arrived promptly, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He looked older than he had a week before, though his manner carried a kind of weary satisfaction. "It's all settled, Miss Marple," he said. "Mrs. Harrow's given a full statement. The details match the evidence exactly. The knife, the letter fragments, the stains at the house. There'll be no doubt in court. She struck him during an argument, then ran. The Major arrived just after and covered for her. Foolish, perhaps, but loyal." Miss Marple nodded, setting her cup down. "Yes, it's rather a pity about loyalty, isn't it? Such a noble thing, and yet it so often ends in disaster." Cray smiled faintly. "You were right from the start, you know. I didn't see it until she came to you. You seemed to expect her that night. One learns to read people, Inspector. The guilty nearly always seek comfort before confession. They crave understanding more than forgiveness." He folded his arms, glancing around the little garden. "You've done this before, I suppose? Seen it end like this?" "Oh, yes," she said softly. "Many times. It's nearly always the same. A small deception, a wound to pride, and then a single rash moment that changes everything. Murder, you see, rarely begins in hatred. It begins in self-pity." Cray looked at her thoughtfully. "And the Major?" "He will recover," she said. "He'll retreat to his regiment or perhaps abroad. Men like him always do. He'll call it exile, but it will be penance. He'll spend the rest of his life remembering that gallantry cannot save those who never asked to be saved." The inspector was silent for a moment. "You know, Miss Marple, sometimes I think you understand people too well. It must be a heavy burden." She gave a little laugh, almost girlish. "Oh, I shouldn't say that. Understanding people makes life quite bearable, so long as one doesn't expect too much from them." Cray's gaze softened. "Well, I suppose we owe you the thanks of the department, though I doubt you care for such things." "My dear Inspector," she said with a twinkle, "I find gratitude very agreeable when it comes with tea." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're remarkable, Miss Marple. Every time I think I've seen everything, you remind me there's always one more truth hiding in plain sight. Human nature, she replied, is a very untidy drawer, Inspector. It's only a matter of knowing where to look. After he left, the garden fell quiet again, save for the rustle of petals stirred by the morning breeze. Miss Marple sat for a long while, her knitting idle in her lap, her eyes resting on the faint pink blossoms that lined the edge of her garden. They were shedding now, drifting one by one onto the grass, a delicate snow of spring's passing beauty. She thought of Felicity Harrow, proud and frightened, of the Major, noble in the way only lonely men can be, and of poor Leonard Harrow, whose pride had been his undoing long before the knife found its mark. They were all, she reflected, prisoners of their own illusions, each acting out the part they thought the world demanded, until the play collapsed under the weight of truth. It was a sad business, but not an uncommon one. People, Miss Marple knew, seldom murdered for gain or vengeance alone. They did it because they feared exposure, of weakness, of failure, of the small humiliations that cut deeper than any blade. She had seen it too often to be surprised. From the lane came the sound of laughter, children chasing one another with hoops and sticks, their voices bright and careless. The world, as it always did, had moved on. Soon the fair would be spoken of in lowered tones, then remembered only as that dreadful affair at the Cherry Blossom Fair, and finally as nothing more than a footnote in the long, quiet history of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose, brushing a petal from her sleeve. She looked up at the cherry tree nearest the gate. Its blossoms were almost gone now, the branches dark against the sky. For a moment, she felt a pang of melancholy, as she often did when beauty passed too soon. Then she smiled faintly. "It's just as well," she murmured. "If blossoms never fell, we'd never have room for the next spring." She turned toward her cottage, where the kettle was just beginning to whistle again, and her steps, though slow, were perfectly steady. Another tragedy ended, another truth laid bare, and life, with all its mysteries, quietly resumed its course. The church bell struck the hour in the distance, deep and clear. Miss Marple paused to listen, then nodded to herself, as though confirming some small private thought. "Yes," she said softly. "People do so love a fair, but it's never the ribbons or the cakes that draw them. It's the promise that, for a little while, the world looks simpler than it truly is." And with that, she closed the garden gate behind her, leaving the blossoms to fall where they would, carried gently by the wind.